Life has been full of tough times, with a few good moments along the way. Losing my parents when I was young hit me hard, like a pain that never fully goes away. But I was lucky because the older William couple who lived next door took me in. They were the kindest people and treated me like their own grandchild, not like someone they had to take care of. We didn't have much money, but we were rich in love, and that was what really mattered. Things changed when they died in a car accident, just as I was about to turn 20 and thinking about going to college. Suddenly, I was on my own again. They left me some money for school and their house in the suburbs. Even though it was full of memories, I decided to sell it because it reminded me of them too much. I used the money to get a small apartment in the city, close to the college where I was going to study financial management. I met Michael at a friend's party. He was easygoing, fun, and didn't care what others thought. We got along right away. He accidentally bumped into me and spilled my drink. "Hey, watch it," I said, more surprised than angry. He smiled and said, "All right, my bad. Let me fix that." "What were you drinking?" I said, "Just beer," and he called out, "2 beers coming right up." That was Michael, simple, straightforward, and relaxed. We talked all night about everything and nothing. We found out we both hated sushi, but loved old movies. Talking to him was easy, and when the party ended, I didn't want to say goodbye. A year later, he proposed. We were watching TV together, just the two of us. He pulled a ring out of his pocket, no big speech or fancy gestures, and said, "Marry me," holding the ring so tightly I thought it might break. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly us, simple and a little messy. "Yes, of course, you big goof," I said. Getting married didn't change much at first. It just felt right. We were the same as before, just officially married. We made ourselves at home in my small downtown apartment, close to the busy city, but having someone to share the quiet moments with made a big difference. Evenings didn't feel so lonely anymore, and for the first time in a long while, life felt complete. Marriage brought some comforts, but just when you start feeling settled, life can throw surprises your way. Michael's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jacob, were wonderful people. From the start, they welcomed me warmly into their cozy suburban home. I could see where Michael got his laid-back attitude from. Their kindness was a balm to my still-hurting heart after losing my own family. Mrs. Jacob would often say, "We're so happy you're part of our family now," and squeeze my hand with a firm, yet gentle touch. I'd always say, "Thank you so much for making me feel so welcome." We began spending weekends with them, having backyard barbecues and long chats over hot cups of coffee. Life felt simple, honest, and good until it wasn't. Michael had to go on a work trip for a year, taking him out of state. The timing wasn't ideal, but it was a great chance for his career. Soon after he left, Mr. and Mrs. Jacob's health started to decline. It happened quickly, and one day Mrs. Jacob called, sounding deeply worried. "Anna," she said, her voice trembling, "we need your help. I'm sorry to bother you, but things aren't good. Mr. Jacob is not doing well." I quickly packed my things and headed to their home. It hurt to see them both looking so frail. Mr. Jacob, who had always seemed so strong, now looked smaller, connected to tubes for his treatment. I settled into their routine, taking care of the cooking and cleaning, while Mrs. Jacob focused on looking after Mr. Jacob. In the evenings, I would read his favorite books to them. Often, he'd fall asleep before I finished a chapter, but on good days, he'd quietly say, "Thank you, Anna," even though his voice was weaker than before. I'd smile and reply, "It's my pleasure," holding his hand to comfort him. One afternoon, while I was preparing dinner, Mrs. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, looking more tired than usual. She wrung her hands nervously and said, "Anna, I don't know how to say this, but we're having some problems. Mr. Jacob was the main provider, and now things are tough." I put down the knife and gave her my full attention. "Sweetie, we're in a tight spot. Would you consider renting out your apartment? I hate to even ask, but maybe it will help us get through this tough time," Mrs. Jacob said, looking down, clearly embarrassed. Her words showed how serious their situation was, and I felt sorry for them. When I had no one, they took me in and became my family, so how could I say no? I tried to ease Mrs. Jacob's worries and said, "Of course, Mrs. Jacob. I'll take care of it right away," without even thinking twice. I found a tenant for the apartment quickly and sent Mrs. Jacob the rent money every month, along with extra for groceries and any unpaid bills. Family is what holds us together, so even though my commute to work became a long, tiring drive, I reminded myself of this on the hardest days. Each time I gave Mrs. Jacob the money, she would say, "You're a godsend, Anna," and I could see her relief. My only comfort was Michael's calls. Hearing his voice was like a brief escape. "How are things going, Jazz? Are you doing okay?" he would ask, even through the static of long-distance calls. I'd force a smile into my voice and say, "We're managing. Don't worry about us," not wanting to add to his stress. But everything changed when Mrs. Jacob's daughter from her first marriage, Shirley, suddenly appeared. The mood in the house shifted instantly, like a cold wind sneaking in. I didn't know her well, but I had heard enough from Michael and had seen how tense things got during her brief, awkward visits. I was already struggling with long drives to work and taking care of Mrs. Jacob, who was bedridden and getting sicker. But with Shirley around, the tension only grew. She made herself comfortable and made it clear she was here to stay. One evening, after a long, tough day, Mr. Jacob weakly called me over. His voice was shaky and low. "Anna, please keep an eye on Shirley," he said. "She's not a good person." His words made my stomach twist. "I understand, Mr. Jacob," I promised, even though I wasn't sure what exactly to watch out for. Just as Mr. Jacob warned, it didn't take long for Shirley to start taking control. The first signs appeared quickly. One morning, I found Shirley in the kitchen, standing by the breakfast table like a storm cloud. She sipped her coffee and looked at me like I didn't belong there. "Just so we're clear, I'm not here to be a maid or a cook for anyone," she said. I was surprised, but I stayed calm. "All right, Shirley," I replied, trying to keep things peaceful. "I can keep handling everything. I've been doing it so far." "Good, because I'm not doing anything. This is Mom's house," she snapped, daring me to challenge her. From that day on, Shirley made sure everyone knew she was there, and not in a friendly way. She ordered takeout just for herself and her mom, leaving the empty boxes for me to clean up. It hurt, but I kept quiet because Mr. and Mrs. Jacob deserved their peace. One evening, Mrs. Jacob, with a hint of her old warmth, said, "Anna, why don't you stay and eat with us tonight?" But before I could answer, Shirley cut in. "Anna has been busy all day, Mom. She probably wants to eat later," acting like she was looking out for me. It was clear I wasn't welcome. The days felt longer, and my chores piled up. Shirley's attitude spread throughout the house. Late at night, I could hear her talking to her mom, using harsh words to turn her against me. Slowly, Mrs. Jacob, who used to be so kind, changed. She thanked me less, and her looks became colder. A few weeks later, Mr. Jacob passed away. Michael flew in for the funeral, just in time to say goodbye. The whole event was sad, but having him, there was a relief. We hadn't seen each other for months, and it felt good to have him by my side during such a hard time. At the funeral, I noticed Shirley acting sweet and polite to everyone, almost too nice. After the service, Michael and I found a moment alone. "How've things been while I've been gone?" he asked softly. "It's been fine. Everything is okay," I said, forcing a smile. He already had enough to deal with, and I didn't want to add to his worries. "Are you sure? You seem a bit tired," he said, looking at me with concern. "It's just been busy helping out around here," I said, trying to brush it off. I said, trying not to look him in the eye. It wasn't the right time to bring up all the problems brewing under the surface. After Michael left, Shirley dropped the act of being the caring sister. Her rude and disrespectful behavior returned, and I had to deal with it once again. The whole mood of the house changed. Maybe it was her way of handling grief, but Mrs. Jacob became distant and cold towards me. Our conversations turned into orders, and I started to feel less like part of the family and more like an outsider. Shirley took control of the house, acting like she was in charge. She didn't care about anyone's feelings but her own. She would even barge into my room without knocking and go through my things, like she was searching for something. One day, I was trying to find some peace in the garden when I noticed a box hidden among the bushes. Curious, I opened it and found my lingerie, jewelry, and watches inside. My heart sank when I saw some of my clothes tossed nearby. Furious, I grabbed the box and stormed back inside. Shirley was lounging in the living room, acting like she owned the place. What the hell, Shirley? I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. You can't just throw out my stuff. She gave a cold, mocking laugh. Anna, you don't live here. You're just a guest and you're not wanted. You'd be better off in the garden or on the street. You're nothing more than a beggar. Her words stung like salt on a wound. I felt my whole body tremble. I turned to Mrs. Jacob, who had just walked into the room. Mrs. Jacob, please, tell her she can't treat me like this. This is supposed to be my home too, I pleaded, my voice cracking. But the once kind Mrs. Jacob looked at me like I was a stranger. This is Shirley's home now. Maybe you should find somewhere else to stay. Her words hit me harder than I could have imagined. Standing there, holding the box, my heart pounded. In that moment, the home and family, I thought I had fell apart. I stayed despite everything because I had made a promise to Mr. Jacob on his deathbed to take care of his wife and make sure Shirley didn't take over. But it felt like Mrs. Jacob was becoming more like Shirley every day. Her looks grew colder and her words harsher. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Mrs. Jacob lost her temper. What are you even doing here? Just sitting around, not helping, she snapped, her voice full of contempt. I tried not to let her words get to me, but I still replied, I'm doing my best to keep things running smoothly. Best? More like you're just using everyone, she sneered before leaving the room. Her comments hurt. I had rented out my apartment and given almost all the money to Mrs. Jacob, so I knew I wasn't just freeloading. Besides, I did most of the chores, while Shirley only complained and criticized. She was the one living off her mom's pension, yet she never let up. What does my brother even see in you? She would taunt through the thin walls every night. I kept reminding myself of the promise I made to Mr. Jacob, biting my tongue to hold back my anger. But the house had become a hostile place, and I felt trapped. One evening, I came home early from work, and something felt off. They didn't know I was there, and as I walked into the living room, I heard Shirley and Mrs. Jacob arguing. We need to make her sell her apartment, Shirley said, her tone cold and selfish. You know how much we could use that money. Yes, but how do we convince her? Anna won't just give it up, Mrs. Jacob replied, sounding frustrated. Leave it to me, Mom. I'll make her do it gently. Once she signs it over, we can finally live the life we deserve, Shirley said, her words dripping with deceit. Hearing them plot to take away my only source of income was a shock. My heart pounded, and I quietly slipped away to my room. They wanted to take everything from me. I couldn't stay after that. The decision was clear. I had to leave. With shaky hands, I quickly packed my things. Every moment in that house felt like a ticking time bomb. I didn't bother saying goodbye. They didn't deserve it. I slipped out the back door and called a cab to take me to the train station. My mind was spinning as I sat on the train headed to Michael's state. I wondered if he would understand, if he would take their side. I was scared of what would happen if I stayed, but the uncertainty of what was ahead was just as terrifying. As the train moved, I watched the scenery pass by, feeling a mix of determination and anxiety. When I arrived at Michael's apartment, he opened the door, surprised to see me standing there with my bag. He looked relieved, but also full of questions. Michael's eyes widened. Anna, why are you here? Is everything okay? He asked, stepping aside to let me in. I took a moment to take in the cozy, warm feeling of his small apartment. Michael, things are not okay. Not at all, I said, my voice trailing off, showing my worry. He led me to the couch. Talk to me, sweetheart. What's going on? He pleaded. I told him everything, how things had gotten worse at home, how Shirley came back, and the final straw, their plan to make me sell my apartment. Before this, I hadn't wanted to burden him while he was busy with work, but now I let it all out. As I spoke, Michael's face grew more serious, his jaw tightening and his fists clenching. By the time I finished, his voice was a mix of worry and anger. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? He asked. I didn't want to make things worse. I thought I could handle it, I admitted, feeling foolish. Damn it, Anna. You shouldn't have had to deal with that alone, he snapped, standing up and pacing. I can't believe my mom and Shirley treated you like this. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes fierce. No one treats my wife this way. No one, he said, pulling out his phone. My heart raced as I watched him dial his mom. The phone barely rang twice before she picked up. I couldn't hear her side of the conversation, but Michael's shoulders were tense. Mom, this has to stop. I know everything, and I won't stand for it. If Shirley stays, or if you don't start treating Anna with respect, then you can forget about any help from us. No more money, nothing, Michael said, his tone firm and unyielding. After a short but heated argument, there was silence. Michael held the phone tight. Finally, he said, "Fine, if that's your choice. Then I've made mine," and hung up. His expression softened as he turned to me. "Looks like it's just us now, sweetie. But that's all we need," he said, walking over to hug me. I leaned into him, feeling the safety of his arms around me, shielding me from all the chaos. "Just us," I whispered, realizing he was right. Now that we were on our own, it somehow felt okay. We stayed up late, talking about practical things, my work-from-home schedule, our budget, and what our life would look like now without the added burden of helping his mom and dealing with Shirley. It felt like a fresh start. We were starting a new chapter together, just the two of us. We're in this together, no matter what. It's just you and me against the world, right? I said. Michael smiled confidently and replied, "Right." With him by my side, I felt stronger and smiled back. The next few days were busy. Thankfully, my boss agreed to let me work from home after I reached out. Michael helped me get my things out of storage, and we set up my home office in the corner of his living room. It was cozy, and even though it wasn't perfect, it felt like ours. After a peaceful week, I got a call that felt like a ghost from the past. It was Mrs. Jacob. Her voice, which used to sound kind, now had a mix of boldness and desperation. "Anna, why haven't I received my payment this month? You know how much we need it," she said, sounding urgent. I was speechless for a moment. How could she have the nerve to ask this after everything? "I'm sorry, but after all that's happened, you really expect me to keep sending money?" I asked, more surprised than angry. I could hear Shirley's sharp voice in the background, saying, "She's just being selfish. Make her send the money." I could picture Mrs. Jacob looking upset, but she finally said, "But we're family," sounding both pleading and angry. "No, family doesn't treat each other like that," I said firmly. "Goodbye, Mrs. Jacob," and I hung up before she could reply. The call shook me, but Michael was there, comforting me. "You made the right choice, Anna," he said, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "It's time they learned to take care of themselves." Not long after, we got a surprise. We found out I was expecting. It was wonderful news, and suddenly the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. We decided it was time to sell my apartment and buy a small suburban home near a good school where our child could grow up. As we were planning the move, Mrs. Jacob called again, but this time her tone was different. She sounded almost desperate. "I'm sorry for everything. Shirley took the money, made me sell the house, and now I have nothing. Can I come live with you and Michael's?" Her request sent a chill down my spine, and I could hear the tremble in her voice. This was a test of my resolve. "When you sided with Shirley against us, Mrs. Jacob, you chose this path. You could have chosen differently," I said, holding firm. I spoke softly, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was hurting inside. "You have a kind heart, Mrs. Jacob, but we all make choices. I know you made mistakes, but I can't just forget what happened," I said. "Can't you forgive an old woman for her bad decisions?" she pleaded. I sighed, feeling sorry for her, but also remembering all the pain her choices had caused. "I have forgiven you, but that doesn't mean I can let you back into my life," I replied. "You have to live with the consequences of your actions, just like I have." Then I hung up and blocked her number. We moved forward with our plans and bought a small, cozy house with a garden for our kids to play in. One lazy Friday morning, I was slowly reading the newspaper and sipping my coffee when a headline caught my eye: "Local woman arrested for massive fraud scheme." I saw a picture of Shirley, looking defeated and in handcuffs. I felt a mix of shock and, to be honest, a bit of relief. "Look at this, Michael," I said, holding up the newspaper. "It's Shirley. She's been arrested for fraud. Michael took the paper and read the story with a serious expression. Wow, that's a lot to take in, but I can't say I'm surprised, he said. She made her choices, and now she's facing the consequences, I said, feeling a sense of closure I didn't realize I needed. Later, we heard from friends that Mrs. Jacob was working 2 jobs and living in a small apartment to get by. The debt Shirley left behind was too much for her pension to cover along with her other expenses. Have you heard about your mom? Michael's friend MH asked when they came over for a barbecue one evening. Yeah, I've heard, Michael replied, flipping burgers on the grill. There was a touch of sadness in his voice, but also determination. She made her choices, and this is the reality now. MH nodded. I just thought you should know. After that, the conversation shifted to lighter topics about work and sports, and the evening carried on. We had moved on, and so had life. When Megan was born, the joy we felt was overwhelming. Everything changed when I became a mom. It changed our dreams and goals, and it even healed some old wounds with new love. Can you believe she's ours? I whispered one night as Michael and I watched Megan sleep in her crib. I whispered softly, and Michael gently replied, I know, as he put his arm around my shoulders. She's perfect, he said, his voice full of warmth. We spent our days marveling at every little thing Megan did, every smile, every giggle. She was our little miracle, and when she was with us, all the bad memories seemed to fade away, making room for happy ones. Every day was simple, but filled with small moments of joy that made our family life feel complete. We would take walks in the park, laughing as Megan tried to chase butterflies. On chilly nights, we'd read books and play games at home. Our love for our daughter brought Michael and me closer, making our bond stronger every day. One bright afternoon, I was sitting in the garden with Megan while Michael was at work. I watched her play with her toys, surrounded by the sweet smell of roses in full bloom. It was a perfect moment, a snapshot of the life we had built together. Look, Mommy, Megan said, holding out a flower she had picked. That's beautiful, sweetheart, I said, smiling at her. I thought about the journey that had brought us here. Even though we had faced hard times, they led us to this peaceful, happy place. I felt so grateful for Michael's love and support and the strength we found in each other. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, Michael reached across the table and took my hand. We've come a long way, haven't we? He said, his eyes full of love. We have, I replied, holding his hand tightly. And I wouldn't change a thing. We looked forward to the future with hope and confidence, knowing that we could face any challenges together. Our hearts were full of joy, our family was strong, and our love was unbreakable. We made sure to cherish every day, savoring each moment and building a life filled with love, happiness, and endless possibilities.